So I got some non-committal nods, but I would say if we're going to average that, that averages out to a solid B plus. Well, we finished Galatians last week, and we're going to start in on Ecclesiastes. Now, I hesitated about that, not because I don't want to study the book, but because I'm gone next week. Turns out that I get to take more than 0 Sundays off. So I've got a guest coming in next week, Pastor Jay Brown, or Reverend Jay Brown. I don't know how he wants to be titled, but he is one of the ordained clergymen here in our circuit, and he also works for Legacy Deo. So next week he will be presenting during the Bible study hour a bit on what they do and how their work blesses the church at large, and probably how you can be involved if you want to. And then he'll lead service as well. But that was the reason it gave me pause, because it's like, do I want to start and then immediately take a week off? So then I was thumbing through my Bible trying to find something I could just do for just 1 week. And I decided it was all foolishness. It was vanity. It was all vanity. It was chasing after the wind. So I decided I would just stick to the plan, Ecclesiastes today. But to get into the book, I thought maybe we should spend a little bit of time on the who and the what of the book. So I guess before I get into any of that stuff, let me talk to you about why I think this is an important book to study. I don't know how much y'all have your finger on the pulse of what's going on in our culture. Some of y'all maybe are more tapped in than me. Some of y'all, it has a pulse. It not only does it have a pulse, it's having palpitations. Okay. Some of y'all might be more tapped in than me, but I suspect a lot of y'all don't pay as much attention to things going on broadly. You're concerned with what's going on in your own life, the people you love, the people you interact with on a daily basis. Totally cool. And I think for the most part, that's probably the wise path. But also understanding that part of what I see my job as is helping prepare you to engage with the world. I do see that as a big part of my job. So I want to make sure that you understand what's going on in the hearts and minds of people. So I think we're going to do a brief history of we're going to do a brief history of the 21st century. Here we go. Let's start. Let's start in ancient Greece. And yeah, let's start with ancient Greece. So back in the days before Jesus, but not that much before Jesus, there was a great time of prosperity in Greece. And one of the things that gave rise to, a few things. They excelled in arts and engineering. And as technology improved, as people could farm more broadly and more easily, as people tended to gather more in cities, people's interests were allowed to be a little bit more diverse. Okay? We'll talk about what happens after that in a little bit. One of the things that comes up during that time is the rise of the philosopher. Now, there were probably philosophers before this, but oftentimes if you think about in the ancient world, what a philosopher would be, it would probably be just like an advisor to the king, like a professional wise person. In Greece, it actually becomes like a popular thing, right? You know the name of some Greek philosophers right now. I guarantee it, right? By show of hands, how many of you have heard of Socrates? By show of hands, how many of you have heard of Plato? How many of you have heard of Silly Putty? One of those was not a philosopher, but in your own time you can research who is who, okay? Yeah, we're aware of this. That prosperity and wealth and the leisure and the diverse interests that came along with that did translate into the Roman Empire because they sort of absorbed the Greek culture wholesale, just about. So through the Roman Empire, you also get up to things like Stoicism. And you will remember from our study of Acts that Paul goes to the Areopagus, and he gets to talk about his belief structure. And everybody's like, this is an interesting new philosophy, right? Because they had like stand-up philosophy at the Areopagus. You could just stand up and give your TED talk, right? And if people liked it, they'd ask you back for more. So that persists through the end of the Roman Empire. But what happens after the Roman Empire is essentially the people got decadent. The bedrocks of culture eroded. And a bunch of, they're called barbarians, broadly in our histories. Conquered Rome, destroyed the culture, literacy plummeted, and the world reverted to a more ancient style of living. In an ancient style of living, the job of most families is make food for your family, right? So maybe you're a hunter, maybe you're a farmer, whatever. That grows into what we think of as medieval, right? Or the Dark Ages. And this is a time when most people are just kind of told what to think by the church, by the ruling authorities. But most people don't have time for that kind of thing. They're concerned with survival. So they're trying to grow enough food that after Prince John and the Sheriff of Nottingham takes all their food, all their taxes, they still have enough to scrape by, right? What follows the Dark Ages is the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is a time when people start they start reclaiming a lot of that stuff from classical Greece. They start rereading the Greeks. And in general, people just start reading more. During the Renaissance is also when the printing press is invented. And when I say Renaissance, as a Lutheran, you should also be thinking Reformation. These things go hand in hand. Education's growing, literacy's growing, right? And advances in technology and the more urbanization lead to a situation where people can be a little bit more diverse. So, from the Renaissance, where people are becoming more and more educated, fast forward another couple hundred years, and you move into a time that's called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a time where people are very focused on logic and reason and rationality. The growth of sciences, like as we think of sciences, really happens, okay? And people's worldview starts to shift. This also, by the way, profoundly changes how people do religion, right? I'll give you an example. Think about a guy like Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was a very important person in the history of this country. I know there are folks who have big personal problems with him. I'm not going into that today. But if you've ever been to Monticello, you've looked at his house, you've seen all his little inventions and all his little doodads and his bed that was measured to within like 2 inches of his height, so it was exactly optimized for, he is very left-brained in a lot of ways, okay? He had a version of the Bible, his personal version of the Bible. You know what he did? He cut out all the supernatural stuff. He was like, this Bible is very important. We should be profoundly influenced as a culture by the moral teachings of Jesus, but also, as a person who is profoundly wrapped into the Enlightenment and all that is rational, he was willing to dispense of all the supernatural stuff and just keep what he thought as the wisdom of it. Okay? With me so far? The Enlightenment kind of ran the show in American culture for a long time, really all the way up through the 1900s. You can think about people as we become moderns, right? Uh, People tend to be more and more rational. The rise of secularism in our nation grew from 1900 to 1999. You see a sharp increase of the people who don't really believe in God, don't really necessarily believe in supernatural stuff, or maybe like they have that vague spirituality thing, you know? And also more and more and more trust in science and worldly wisdom, right? You can see that. And it's been an exponential curve in how much worldly knowledge has changed how we live on a daily basis. You could take George Washington, and if you taught him ancient Hebrew, you could drop him on Abraham's farm, and he could make it just fine. Some of y'all could too. I could not, right? The world is very, very, very different now. There were thousands of years there. There have only been a few hundreds. The curve of how life has changed has spiked up greatly. I would suspect very few of us have ever taken buckets to the river to get water. Very few of us have ever cranked a bucket down to the bottom of a well. Right? Some of us have. It's not just that I get uncomfortable when I don't have electricity. I get frustrated if I don't have good cell signal. You know what I mean? We've been on this steep curve, okay? So it's become more and more that people have invested in their rational left brains, but then something happened, okay? And this would have been a movement that started in probably the 70s, but really blossomed around the millennium and has continued to blossom, which is this movement called postmodernism. Modernism believes that everything's rational, everything can be understood. Postmodernism rejects that stuff, okay? Postmodernism says basically, there's no such thing as actual truth. You've got your version, I've got my version. We all have our truth, right? But nobody has an exclusive claim on the truth because it doesn't exist. Now, hopefully you don't agree that truth doesn't exist. You're here because you're brought here by the way, the truth, and the life, okay? But this is a big movement going on in our society. And it's part of what has led to the idea that a person is responsible for defining their full identity. Because there's nothing there anyways other than what you want to be there. Does this make sense? We are living in a time in which the idea of truth per se has been broadly rejected by the culture. And a lot of people don't realize it yet. And most people aren't all the way there, but it's more and more all the time. It would seem like if you say, well, there is no such thing as truth, you can make up whatever truth you want, that sounds like freedom, right? I can just whatever I want. But in fact, what people experience is paralysis or fatalism or depression, right? The end of postmodernism really comes down to something that is called nihilism. Anybody heard of nihilism before? What it means is nihilo is the Latin word that means nothing. Bohemian Rhapsody? You guys have heard Bohemian Rhapsody by Queen? How's that song end? Nothing really matters. Nothing really matters to me. It's a very nihilistic song, by the way. If you listen to it all the way through, it's very nihilistic. It's fun to watch Wayne and Garth like jam out in the car, right? But that's a reference for people of a certain age. But where a lot of people are landing today is nihilism, the belief that nothing really matters. And it's actually a place of despair and hopelessness. And you can understand that, right? You see this in people's reluctance to engage with what's going on in the world. Or people who are so frustrated about, like, I've preached about this recently, and I'll talk about it a little bit today as well, that you can turn on the news, and on this channel it says one thing, and on that channel it says the exact opposite thing, and they both say it like it's true. And a lot of people face that and go, I guess I'll just never really know. It's a bad place to be. Yep.
I heard a riddle. It's greater than God, less than Satan. Rich people want it, poor people have it.
Greater than God,
Lesser than Satan.
lesser than Satan. Rich people want it,
Want it.
and poor people have it. It's got to be nothing.
Nothing.
Yeah. So why am I bringing all of that up? Why did I just walk you through a few thousand years of history? I'm going to read you Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 2. And then we're going to go back and talk about Solomon here for a little bit. But Ecclesiastes 1, verse 2. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. If you want to talk about somebody who understands the spirit of our times, it's this guy from thousands of years ago. We're going to come back to that in a little bit. But this is one of the reasons I think it's important to engage with this book, because he has lived through the exact sort of existential crisis that is plaguing our culture today. And he has some good things to say about it. We'll get there by and by. All right, so let's start off by just talking about who wrote this book. So if you got it open, chapter 1, verse 1, somebody read it out loud. Yep, son of David, king in Jerusalem. What's his name? Solomon. All right, let's establish what we know about Solomon. Give me a Solomon fact.
Son of David.
Okay. Son of David, good. You don't have to have this knowledge from the verse we just read. What else do you know about Solomon? Rich. What else? Wise. I find that one, while said factually in the Bible, tough because of how his story plays out. But we'll come back to that. What else do you know about him? It's okay if that's all you know. That's okay. I can walk you through some of his story. But you know anything else about Solomon before I do that? Strong? Oh, in what way? Probably not physically strong. Okay. Well, let me walk you through. You can read about the life of Solomon. There's a short version of it in Chronicles, but the longer version of it you can find in 1 Kings. So to take you through a real quick overview of how the Old Testament works, 1st and 2nd Samuel follow the prophet Samuel up to and including the selection of Saul as the first king of Israel, the selection of David, to who succeeds him, the drama between Saul and David that persists Saul's whole life, and David's ascension to the throne. Okay? When we move into 1 Kings, it's the transition from David to Solomon, and then the kings that come after. Good so far? So early in the book of 1 Kings, David is passing the torch to Solomon. Chapter 3, Solomon is about to become king, and so he prays, God, I'm about to become king of this great people, and I am not up to the task. And God says to him, well, I'll tell you what, you ask me for something, I'll give it to you. Whatever you ask, I'll give it to you. What does Solomon ask for? Wisdom. And God says, nice choice. You didn't ask for riches, you didn't ask for a long life, you asked for wisdom. But because you asked for wisdom, because you want to care for these people, I will also give you riches. I will also give you a long life. And it says in chapter 3 that then God destines him to be the wisest man that ever lived. We'll go forward a couple chapters because there's some build up to this happening, literally. One of the projects that David wanted to take on but was never allowed to take on was he wanted to build the temple for the Lord. Ever since Moses led the people out of Egypt, where was the presence of God to be found? In the Ark of the Covenant, yes, and where would they put that? In the tabernacle, right? A tent. Well, David finally gets to settle down, and he wants to build a house for himself, but he says, this feels weird. I shouldn't build a house for myself while God still lives in a tent. But God said to David, it's not for you. You've been a man of war and conquest, and he did that at God's direction. But still, he says, you're not the right guy. But I tell you what, because you love me, because you want this, I will give that honor to your son. So Solomon builds the temple. The temple, right? It's been torn down and rebuilt a couple times, but the temple, okay? So chapter 6, he builds the temple, and there's a dedication for the temple. Chapter 7, then he builds a palace for himself. And this is the right way to go. You build for God, then, And then God comes to him in chapter 9. And has a sort of renewed promise to him. The same promise he gave to David. He kind of renews that to Solomon. He says that if you obey me, I will establish your throne forever. And this kingdom will thrive. If you don't obey me, destruction is going to come. Well, Solomon is wise, and he's obeying the Lord, and his reputation grows. What you get in in chapter 10 is that his fame is spreading, and the nations of the world start coming to check him out, and they bring homage to him, right? So now the wealth of the nations is flowing into Jerusalem. And, you get all those stories about the Queen of Sheba comes because she wants to watch him hold court because he's so smart, It's exactly sort of that high point you think about when you think about Solomon. So he's rich, he's famous, and Jerusalem, Israel, is growing in prominence on the world stage, such that everybody is looking to Israel. And everybody wants to befriend Israel. That's why they're bringing homage, right? That was chapter 10. Chapter 11. Solomon pursues his bliss with women. He does it properly, he marries them. 700 of them. Maybe that's not so proper. And then there's another 300 ladies that he doesn't marry. And it isn't said that that's his downfall exactly. It is. But here's why. That's a problem all on its own, okay? And I've heard people talk about, it's like the treaties and stuff, and there were political marriages, and he had to do it. No. That's not what it says in your Bible. It says that he pursued them for the love in his heart. And I don't think this is like the noble kind of love, okay? But what happens is these foreign women that he's welcoming in for his own gratification lead him into idolatry. Even if he's not actively worshiping their gods on his own, and I think there's a little bit of reason to think he probably is, because he's helping build these sacred sites to these foreign gods. The long and the short of it is, he has lost his faithfulness to God. And it sort of spells the end of the glory days of Israel. After Solomon, the kingdom will be fractured, and it will never come back together in the history of the world so far. Israel and Judah become separated as his two sons, who both seize the throne, split the people up. And there's never a reconciliation. And from there, you know what happens. Exile, destruction of the temple. It takes a long time before the people ever get back to Israel, and their glory is never restored in the same way. Okay? That's the story of Solomon's life. So, having said all that, I was trying to piece together where in his life is the book of Ecclesiastes written. And there's a little bit of a thing that frustrates me, I guess, just as a curious human, is toward the end of Solomon's story in 1 Kings, and the same thing happens in Chronicles. They're like, and there's a lot more that we could tell you about the life of Solomon, but those are all written in this other book, so, and we don't have that book. Cool. That's okay. So anyways, that sets the stage for us. When is the book of Ecclesiastes written? I think it's written probably at the end of the story we get in 1 Kings. I think already he's probably going through some of that decline of the kingdom. It would seem to me as I read this book, and you'll probably have your own thoughts on this as well, that this is a time toward the end of his life when he has a retrospective. Like the time you'd write your memoirs. I think that's kind of where he's at in his career. Looking toward his last days and thinking. I think that the book of Proverbs, which is not fully, but large sections of it are written probably by Solomon, was probably a running thing. You know, as he became a father, he was trying to write down these ideas for his sons. You know, I think that Ecclesiastes is farther down the road than that. I think it's probably toward the end of his life, which gives him a bit of perspective. Hey, who is the strongest man in the Bible? Don't say Jesus. Nope, not David. Not David, though. Come on, strongest guy. Samson. Yeah, Samson. Let's roll real quickly through the narrative of Samson. I don't want to spend any time on this, but you know, we can do it in a minute. Samson is a strong guy. He eventually betrays his oath to God because of a foreign woman. But how does his story end? Do you know? He's enslaved. They've blinded him. He's at the party. Oh, man. What's that? Yeah, he prays to God, a prayer of repentance, and basically asks for one last opportunity to Hulk out, right? And he does. God gives him the strength in that moment. And I think the story of Solomon kind of runs a little bit parallel. It's like absolutely wise until he forsakes God. And then, maybe at the end of it all, as he starts to understand what God's been saying to him all along, his wisdom's restored to him at the end. To me, I think that's maybe what's going on in this book. Maybe I'm reaching, maybe I'm overstretching, but that's kind of how I think this is going. So we got a few minutes. I want to go ahead and just get started in on the book, chapter 1. The words of the preacher, or maybe yours says teacher, or some translations say convener. I don't know. It's not going to greatly change our understanding, whichever one of those you chose. The son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Somebody tell me real quick, what is vanity? What does that word mean? It's not a word we use a lot other than furniture. What does vanity mean? I think we use it in probably two ways, right? Vanity, of course, is the noun version of vain, right? If someone is vain, what's that? Okay, if someone is vain, is it V-A-I-N? Yeah. A particular English major, whom I love, shook her head at me when I wrote that up there. It's not a weather vane. Nope, it's not that. Vain. Yeah. So if someone is vain, what would we say? What does that mean? Self-absorbed, self-centered. Yeah. Very concerned with image, right, which is very surface level. So you can kind of hold that at the one level. But what if we said that you do something in vain? What does that mean? Like, I tried in vain. Yeah, it's useless, right? Or maybe empty, right? Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. How would you say that if you were just going to put it in your own language? Because that's probably not what you would say. What would you say? Everything is useless. Everything is meaningless. Everything is surface level and shallow. Nothing means anything. This is a good example of why we don't just grab one verse in the Bible, pull it out of context, and live by it. Right? If this is the verse you get, you will not understand anything about God or the gospel or how to live, right? But it's important to understand where he's coming from. And are we hearing this in our world today? I think so. I think you are meeting people every day who feel like this, and they don't know what to do about it. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes, and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. By the way, I know it's a little bit pedantic, but I do want to hang a lantern on this. Here he says the earth remains forever. Remember, and you can probably tell this if you're looking at your Bible, are these verses written in a normal block justified paragraph form? Yeah, it's laid out like poetry. Okay? So I'm a big proponent that when you are reading in the Bible, you should be aware of the genre that you're reading. It'll help proper interpretation. Right now, what we're reading is poetic, right? So we expect in poetry that things will be emotional. We expect to use sometimes heightened language. Does this verse existing in your Bible mean that the world will never come to an end? No. That's not the point of this verse, but he is laying out this idea that we experience this cycle of living and dying, living and dying. That's the human perspective on it. And the world, if I were to frame this my own way, verse 4 seems to be like he's saying, and the world is indifferent to it. The world doesn't care if it's you or your grandpa. As far as the world's concerned, those two things are interchangeable. Right? The sun rises and the sun goes down. and hastens to the place where it was. The wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and round goes the wind, and its circuits, and on its circuits, the wind returns. All right. If you're going to describe Solomon's worldview right now, geometrically, what shape would he say the world is? He would not say it's flat. I don't think he's a flat earther. I actually don't. Yeah, he's describing history and the procession of the world as a circle, right? The sun, well, we're going to do an east-west orientation. The sun rises, loops down underneath, and rises again, right? And it just keeps going and going and going. Is it helpful to think about history in this way? Maybe. Is it people's experience of life? Maybe. If you have a cubicle job that you arrive at 9, you push papers all day and you leave at 5, and you come back the next day and do it all over again, this is probably how you feel about life. Or, when you're going to write your 45th sermon of the year, you might be like, oof. Whatever your particular rhythms of life are. And this isn't necessarily bad. At some level, I think routine helps. Right? You kind of know what to expect. If the sun didn't come up tomorrow morning, I think we'd be a little bit concerned. Might not know what to do, right? Unless you live in Alaska and you're just used to the sun either not going down or not coming up. Now, I would suggest to you that this is a fine way to look at the world. Okay? If you're looking at it top down, right? In 2 dimensions. But what if we think about it not like a loop, but like a spring? You're going to have cycles, but guess what? With the proper perspective, you'll see that they're actually going somewhere. If you're looking right down the hole, you might not see it. If you can step off the plane a little bit, you might see that actually they are proceeding somewhere. But he's not in that perspective right now. Right now, he's just thinking it doesn't matter. Days come, days go. We do it all over again. Verse 7. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. Here we have another picture of this enduring cycle. But we're reading poetry here, right? Help me understand the character here. He says the streams flow, but the seas never get full. What sort of feeling would you put on that?
Sounds like they're not accomplishing a purpose.
Yeah. It's like, why do they bother? They will never fill the ocean. They're just going to constantly do it. I would characterize this as being a statement that's something like frustration or despair, right? The job's never done. Read the next verse with me. All things are full of weariness. A man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. There's parallelism here between last verse and this verse. What is the ear like? It's like the ocean. What is the eye like? It's like the ocean. You keep pouring in and pouring in and pouring in, and it's never full. I know we'll come on to these topics again because he's just laying out the general thesis, and he'll go into particulars deeper later. But there was a time when I used to get on the radio like a comedy radio station, right? So you could listen to different people do their stand-up comedy kind of thing, whatever. And it's really fascinating. Looking back on it, it's really fascinating. Early on, I would laugh easy and often, right? But then, as I listened more, and maybe I heard some of the same jokes, the laughter didn't come as easily. Or maybe I was just starting to learn the rhythms and the way that comedy works. Or maybe I was just used to it. And so it would take something a little bit more novel, or a little bit more abrasive, or a little bit more off kilter, or whatever, to get that same response. I think this is true in a lot of areas. We talked about cheesecake a few weeks ago, didn't we? Right? It's like you have it that one day and it's like amazing. You have it that second day and maybe it's still amazing, but maybe a little less amazing. And maybe you chalk it up to the fact that it's not as fresh. But I don't think that's really the problem. There's this idea of absence makes the heart grow fonder. And while that is true in relationships in some regard, I think there's a broader principle here, which is to say those things in this world that can give pleasure, and maybe the sensation of fulfillment, often are unsustainable, right? You just go farther and farther down the road, and the river keeps pouring into the ocean, but the ocean never actually fills up. Verse 9. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, "See, this is new"? It's already been in the ages before us. Is that true? Or is Solomon being a little naive here? Remember, we talked about that ramp up of technology, and from Solomon's life, it would have been a much more shallow curve. Do we think there's nothing new under the sun? Yeah.
Depends how you think about it. Technology, okay, but think about how people act, right? There's people acting the same way now that they did 2,000 years ago, probably 5,000 years ago.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so human nature hasn't changed. The tools have, probably in their particulars. I'm going to be a little kooky here for a minute. Like that Greek guy with the crazy hair. There's a lot of stuff about the ancient world we really don't understand. And we think we know how they lived, but we don't really know how they lived. And I'm not saying that they had the internet, but who knows what they did have? I think we're very convinced of the novelty of our time. But verse 11, and then we'll circle back. Because I do want to get back to your point, Glenn, because you're spot on. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come after. History repeats itself, yes, but in particular, archaeology is an important field. Do you know why it's an important field? Because nobody remembers. They're trying to uncover secrets and mysteries that are lost. What do you know about Hammurabi? What do you know about Sennacherib? What do you know about Nebuchadnezzar? I mean, we can fit what we know about the Nebuchadnezzar of the book of Daniel, probably on a single page of Wikipedia. Right? Now you could say, oh, there's whole books written, whatever. Yeah, but what they're doing is they're laying out the case for trying to piece together a story that we don't actually know. Yeah.
I would also say, you started off by talking about, we see history in the news every day, but people talking about what happened like earlier this week or yesterday, and there's two different versions, and you can't figure out what's the truth, right?
Oh, yeah.
What makes you think that reading something written 1,000 years ago was probably written by whoever conquered the people that, there's going to be rationalization, all the other things that go on with our news today was probably going on in those historical chronicles, whatever we do have that didn't survive.
Yeah. I mean, we frequently hear people say history was written by the victors, right? And there is probably some truth to that. I don't like the idea that automatically means we can't trust it. I think, you have to have a certain careful skepticism no matter what, right? And it's just as wrong to side with the conquered people as it is to side with the conquerors, But Solomon sees something here that is so true in our day. And it feels like our memory is shortening all the time, doesn't it? Is there anything new under the sun? Well, I guess that depends on your perspective, for sure. Right? That's the point Glenn was making. Maybe there's never been one day somebody invented the McRib. That happened one day, right? And by God's mercy, I hope it never happened before, right? You can parse this stuff down to really fine, great thing. There was a day when Leo Fender made the first Stratocaster, and I think it's okay to say there was never a Stratocaster before that. There's always been music, and instruments go way, way, way back. So, but I think that also a lot of this has to do with your perspective, right? So if you're looking at it like this, and you're only seeing this much of the wheel, it's probably pretty easy to name all the new things. But if you could see the history of the world like this, you're probably going to see that, in fact, a lot of the things you think are new really aren't. And just like Glenn said earlier, and I think this is a good point to probably end on, the biggest thing is that as Jim said, whatever the tools are, whatever the style is, the human heart hasn't changed at all. That's part of the reason that the Bible is so valuable, because when you read it, not just hold in your mind the highlights of the greatest hit stories that you had when you were a little kid. No, read the Bible. And pay attention to the people in the Bible. You know them. You know people just like them, and you are people just like them. And that's part of the way that the Bible preserves so much value over the thousands of years since it was first written down. The places, the names change, but people are still lonely and hurting. People are still trying to fill the hole in their heart that can't be filled with anything but God. People still struggle with one another. People still struggle with hopelessness. We have the same God who loves you just as much as he loved Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. I think we're going to stop there for today. We're at 10 till. So we'll pick it up at verse 12 in 2 weeks. All right? So I'll give you a little bit of time to study. But yeah, thank you. And I know we're kind of walking through a dark patch here. There is hope in this book, and we'll get there. But for now, I just wanted to kind of lay out that Solomon gets us, right? He gets exactly what's going on in our culture. So, all right, stick around. We got church coming up in about 10 minutes.